The stone beneath her bare feet was cold enough to sting, but Wren did not slow down. She took the tower steps 2 at a time, counting them the way she always did, because counting was the only map she had ever needed. 51 steps from the bottom of the watchtower to the top. She had walked them every single morning for 6 years, and she would walk them again tomorrow, and the day after that, no matter how many people in Ashwood called her foolish for it. Behind her, faint and mocking, she heard laughter drifting up from the training yard. She knew that laugh. It belonged to Garrett, the Alpha's nephew, who never missed a chance to remind her that she was blind, that she was Omega, that she was nothing worth noticing. She kept climbing anyway. Her fingers brushed the familiar groove in the wall where the stone had worn smooth from years of the same hand sliding along it, and she let that groove guide her the last few steps until the wind hit her face and told her she had reached the top. The horn was waiting exactly where it always waited, resting on a cracked wooden stand beside the broken remains of an old iron bell. She lifted it with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, worn smooth along the mouthpiece from a lifetime of use before it had ever been hers. Her father used to say a horn like this one did not belong to a person, it belonged to a promise. She had been only a child when he told her that, and she had not understood what he meant. She still did not fully. But she raised it to her lips anyway, drew in a breath that filled her chest completely, and blew. The sound rolled out over Ashwood like something alive. It moved through the pine trees below the tower, over the sleeping rooftops of the pack houses, out across the ridge where the fog had not yet burned away. For one long moment, everything in the world seemed to hold still and listen. Then the sound faded, swallowed by the mountains, and the morning went on as if nothing had happened at all. It always went on as if nothing had happened. That was the part nobody else in Ashwood understood. To them, the horn was an old superstition, a leftover ritual from a war that had ended before most of them were born. To Wren, it was the only thing in her life that felt certain. Her father had sounded this horn every morning of her childhood, right up until the day he did not wake up to do it, and she had taken his place without being asked, because someone had to, and because leaving the tower silent felt like abandoning something too important to name. She lowered the horn and rested it back on its stand, letting her fingers trail over the worn wood one more time before she turned to go. That was when she heard it, not the wind, not the birds beginning to stir in the branches below. Something else, distant and low, rolling across the mountains from the north. A horn, answering hers. Wren went completely still. Her hand found the stone railing beside her, gripping it hard enough that her knuckles ached. In 6 years, no other horn had ever answered, not once. She had told herself, more times than she could count, that the ritual was pointless, that she kept it alive only out of grief and habit, and a stubborn refusal to let her father's memory fade. But now the sound rolled toward her again, deeper than her own horn, richer, unmistakably real, and every hair on her arms rose at once. She could hear the difference immediately. Her horn was old and cracked at the base, its sound thin and reedy no matter how hard she blew. This one was full and resonant, the kind of sound that came from a horn carried by someone who meant to be heard from very far away. It was not an echo. It was not her imagination playing tricks with the wind. Someone, somewhere beyond the ridge, had heard her horn and chosen to answer it. Below her, the training yard had gone silent. She could hear boots scrambling against packed dirt, voices rising sharp and fast, the clatter of someone knocking over a weapon rack in their hurry. Fear had a sound of its own, and Ashwood was making it now, loud and unmistakable. Wren. That was Garrett's voice, no longer mocking, cracking instead with something close to panic. What did you do? What in the world did you just do? She did not answer him. She was too busy listening, straining every part of herself toward the sound that still hung faintly in the air, fading now, but real. Whoever had answered was not close. Not yet. But they had heard her, and they had chosen to respond, and that meant something. It meant the horn had never been a hollow tradition at all. By the time she made her way carefully back down the 51 steps, guided by the wall and the familiar shape of the stairwell, the entire pack had gathered in the yard. She could tell by the number of voices, the shuffling of feet, the tight, nervous energy crackling through the air like static before a storm. Someone grabbed her arm the moment she reached the bottom step, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Do you understand what you might have done? The voice belonged to Alpha Corin, Ashwood's leader, a man who had never once addressed her directly in 6 years except to complain about her existence. If that horn was answered by an enemy pack, you may have just called an attack down on all of us. It wasn't a threat, Wren said, keeping her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. I don't know how I know that, but I know it. You're blind, Corin snapped, and the word landed the way it always did, meant to wound. You don't know anything. You hear an old horn and decide it means something because you want it to mean something. Because you've spent 6 years telling yourself your father's silly ritual actually matters. The word stung, but Ren had heard worse from him before, and she had learned long ago not to let her face show it. She lifted her chin instead. Then explain why nothing has answered that horn in 6 years. And today, the very morning it does, you're standing here shaking instead of laughing at me. Nobody had an answer for that. The yard went quiet except for the wind and the distant, restless movement of the pack shifting on their feet, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Ren stood in the middle of it, sightless eyes turned toward the ridge where the second horn had sounded, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear, certainty. Whatever was coming, it was not coming to destroy them. She could not have explained how she knew that if her life depended on it, but the knowledge sat in her chest solid as stone, unmovable, undeniable. The pack spent the rest of the morning preparing for an attack that Ren was almost certain would never come, at least not in the way they feared. Scouts were sent out along the northern paths. Weapons were sharpened until the whetstones wore thin. Mothers pulled their children indoors and barred the shutters, and the training yard that had rung with insults toward her only hours earlier now rang with the frantic clatter of a pack readying itself for danger. Ren was left alone through most of it, forgotten in the chaos, which suited her fine. She made her way to the edge of the yard, found the low stone wall she knew from memory, and sat down to listen. She had always listened better than anyone gave her credit for. Blindness had taken her sight the year she turned 7, an illness that swept through Ashwood and left 3 children without their eyes, and 1 without her life at all. Ren had survived, and in the years since, her hearing had sharpened into something almost uncanny. She could tell the difference between Garrett's footsteps and his brother's before either of them spoke a word. She could hear a storm coming a full day before the clouds arrived. She could hear, now, the particular texture of fear moving through Ashwood, brittle and short-tempered, laced with something that sounded almost like guilt. Guilt. That surprised her. She turned her head toward the sound of 2 elders murmuring near the well, their voices pitched low, clearly not meant for other ears. She could not make out every word, but she caught fragments. Old debt, the northern ridge, something about a war long since buried, and a name that made both elders fall silent the moment they said it aloud. Draven. She did not know the name, had never heard it spoken in Ashwood before, but the way the elders said it sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. Whoever Draven was, the mention of him frightened people who had lived through wars Ren had only heard about in whispered stories. She thought of asking Corin outright, demanding an explanation the way she had every right to, but something told her the Alpha would only lie to her face the way he always did, dismissing her questions as the imaginings of a blind girl who understood nothing of pack politics. So instead she sat quietly at the edge of the yard, listening, waiting, letting the pieces settle around her like snow. By midday, the scouts had returned, and their reports sent a fresh wave of tension rippling through Ashwood. A group was approaching from the north, moving with purpose, not stealth. They were not hiding their approach, which in itself was unusual. An enemy, meaning harm, would come quietly, under cover of darkness, not march openly across the ridge in broad daylight where every watchful eye in the territory could see them coming. Ren gathered as much from the frantic conversations swirling around her, snippets caught here and there as pack members hurried past, too distracted by their own fear to notice her sitting motionless on the stone wall. She pieced together that the approaching group was sizable, disciplined, moving in careful formation rather than a chaotic rush. That, more than anything, told her these were not raiders looking for an easy target. This was something else, something deliberate. She thought again of the horn, of the way it had answered hers so cleanly, so precisely, as if whoever blew it had been listening for exactly that sound for a very long time. A signal recognized instead of a threat detected. The thought settled into her chest and refused to leave. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the pack gathered along the ridge overlooking the northern approach, weapons ready, nerves stretched thin as bowstrings. Ren stood near the back, allowed there only because nobody had bothered to send her away, and listened as the first sounds of the approaching group reached her ears. Footsteps, many of them, moving in unison. The soft creak of leather. The low murmur of voices kept deliberately quiet, disciplined, controlled. And then, cutting through all of it, a single voice rose above the rest, clear and commanding, carrying easily across the distance despite its calm and measured tone. "Stand down. We have not come for battle." The words rippled through Ashwood like a physical force. Ren felt the pack around her tense and then, slowly, begin to relax, though nobody lowered their weapons entirely. She strained to place the voice, memorizing its cadence the way she memorized everything, filing away the low, even tone, the faint accent that marked the speaker as coming from somewhere far beyond Ashwood's borders. "We seek only an audience," the voice continued, closer now, close enough that Ren could hear the shuffle of many feet coming to a deliberate halt. "I am here for the one who sounded the horn this morning. Nothing more." A ripple of confusion swept through the gathered pack. Ren felt eyes turn toward her before anyone spoke a word, felt the weight of sudden, unwanted attention settle over her like a physical thing. Corin's voice rose, sharp with suspicion. "State your name and your business, and perhaps we will consider your request." There was a pause, brief but heavy, before the voice answered. "My name is Draven. I lead the Blackthorn Pack, and my business, Alpha Corin, is with the Omega who blew that horn, not with you." The name landed among the gathered pack like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, carrying whispers of old fear, and older stories that Ren had never been told in full. She felt Corin stiffen beside her without needing to see it, sensed the sudden, careful shift in the way the entire pack held itself, no longer merely wary but genuinely afraid. Ren stood very still at the edge of the crowd, her sightless eyes fixed toward the sound of that voice, her heart hammering hard enough that she was certain everyone around her could hear it too. Whatever this man wanted with her, whatever debt or history connected him to a ritual she had kept alive without understanding why, she was about to find out, whether Ashwood liked it or not. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of unfamiliar wolves across the ridge, and somewhere in that scent, Ren caught something else entirely, not danger, something closer to recognition, as if the wind itself remembered a promise made long before she was born, and had finally, after all these years, come to collect it. Corin turned toward Ren before she could gather her thoughts, his hand closing around her shoulder hard enough to make her flinch. "Say nothing," he hissed, low enough that only she could hear. "Whatever this is, whatever debt you think you understand, you say nothing until I decide how to handle it." Ren pulled her shoulder free of his grip, something she had never dared do before, but the fear that had gripped her only moments earlier was already burning away, replaced by something sharper, curiosity, defiance, a refusal to be spoken over in a moment that clearly, undeniably, belonged to her. "With respect," she said, loud enough to carry. "He asked for me, not for you." A murmur swept through the gathered pack, equal parts scandal and disbelief. Nobody spoke to Corin that way, least of all an Omega who had spent 6 years being told she was worth nothing. But Ren stepped forward anyway, one careful step and then another, using the memory of the ridge's slope to guide her feet until she stood at the very front of Ashwood's gathered defenders, facing the direction the voice had come from. "I am the one who sounded the horn," she said, and though her heart pounded fast enough to make her dizzy, her voice came out steady. "My name is Ren." Silence answered her first, long enough that she began to wonder if she had misjudged the moment entirely. Then footsteps approached, deliberate and unhurried, the crunch of boots against frost-hardened grass growing louder, until she could sense a presence stopping only a few feet away. Whoever he was tall. She could tell that much from the way his voice now seemed to come from higher above her than she expected, and from the way the air around him seemed to shift, thick with authority the way the air around a mountain storm grows heavy before the rain finally falls. "Ren," Draven said, and there was something strange in the way he spoke her name, almost reverent, as though he had been waiting a very long time to say it aloud. "Do you know why you sound that horn every morning?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it was the exact question she had asked herself every single day for 6 years, without ever finding a satisfying answer. "Because my father did," she said. "Because someone has to keep it alive, even if nobody understands why." "Your father," Draven repeated, and something in his voice shifted, gentler now, almost sorrowful. "You are Elias's daughter." Hearing her father's name spoken by a stranger sent a jolt through Ren's chest, sharp enough to steal her breath. Nobody outside Ashwood had known her father's name in years, not since his death. Not since the rest of the world seemed to have forgotten he ever existed at all. "You knew my father?" "I owe your father my life," Draven said simply. "And I have spent every year since his passing, wondering if that debt would ever be called due. This morning it finally was." Behind her, Ren heard Corin shift uneasily, clearly desperate to insert himself back into a conversation that had left him entirely behind. "Explain yourself," the Alpha demanded, his voice sharp with the particular anger of a man who hated feeling irrelevant. "What debt? What history do you have with this pack that none of us were ever told about?" Draven did not answer immediately. Instead, Ren heard the soft shift of fabric, the faint clink of some object being retrieved, and then felt something pressed gently into her hands. It was smooth and cold, metal shaped into a curve she recognized instantly from the shape alone. A horn, smaller than hers but similarly worn, similarly cared for across many years. "This belonged to my father," Draven said quietly. "Before he died, he made me swear an oath. He told me that if the horn from Ashwood's tower ever sounded again, truly sounded, carried by someone who meant it and not merely performed as habit, I was to answer it myself, and I was to come, no matter the cost, no matter how many years had passed." "Why?" Ren asked, turning the unfamiliar horn over in her hands, tracing its shape the way she traced everything unfamiliar, building a picture of it in the only way she knew how. "Because your father saved my father's life during the border conflict, 23 years ago," Draven said. "A conflict most in Ashwood have chosen to forget, though I suspect your elders remember it very well." He paused, and Ren heard the edge in his voice sharpen, directed now at the pack gathered behind her rather than at her. "During the worst of the fighting, my father's unit was ambushed and left for dead in territory controlled by Ashwood's rivals. Elias found them. He could have left them to die. Instead, he carried my father across 3 miles of hostile ground on his own back, under threat the entire way, and delivered him safely home." A hush fell over the gathered pack, broken only by the restless shifting of feet and the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere above the ridge. Ren felt the weight of every eye in Ashwood settle on her, and for the first time in her life, it did not feel like the weight of pity or mockery. It felt like something closer to disbelief, mixed uneasily with something that might have been shame. "My father made a promise that day," Draven continued, "that the debt would never be forgotten, and that it would be repaid whenever it was called. When Elias passed, I assumed the promise had died with the horn that once carried it. Every morning for 6 years I have listened at dawn, hoping to hear it answered, and every morning, nothing came. Until today." Ren's throat tightened around words she could not quite find. All those mornings, all those years of climbing 51 steps in the cold and the dark, mocked by a pack that considered her ritual meaningless, and the entire time, someone far beyond the mountains had been listening, waiting, hoping to hear proof that a promise made decades ago still mattered to someone. "You've been listening," she said quietly, "this whole time?" "Every morning," Draven confirmed. "I did not know if the horn would ever sound again the way it needed to. Many mornings, Ashwood's tower stayed silent entirely. I feared the tradition had died along with your father, and that the debt would remain forever unpaid, a stain on my family's honor that I had no way to correct." Corin's voice cut through the moment, sharp with something that sounded almost like panic now rather than authority. "This is absurd. A childhood promise from decades ago does not warrant an armed pack marching onto Ashwood's territory. If you sought to settle an old debt, you might have sent a message rather than an army." "They are not an army," Ren said before Draven could respond, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. She could hear it now, clearly, the way the visiting pack held itself, disciplined but not aggressive, weapons carried but not drawn, postures wary rather than threatening. They came prepared for danger because they did not know what kind of welcome they would receive. That is not the same as coming to attack us. A pause followed her words, and then, unmistakably, she heard something in Draven's tone that might have been the beginning of respect. "She is correct," he said. "We came prepared for the possibility of hostility, not with the intention of causing it. I would not have marched an unannounced force onto foreign territory without reason enough to justify the risk, and I had reason enough. I needed to know if the horn still meant something. I needed to know if the promise still lived." "And now that you know?" Ren asked. "Now I intend to honor it properly," Draven said. "Whatever the pack of Ashwood requires, whatever debt remains unpaid to Elias's memory, I will see it settled. But first, I would like to speak with his daughter directly, without an audience, if she is willing." Corin began to object again, something about propriety and protocol, but Ren spoke over him before he could finish, feeling a boldness she had never allowed herself before rise up hot and certain in her chest. "I'm willing," she said. "I have questions of my own." The gathered pack shifted uneasily as Draven stepped closer, and Ren felt the strange, charged silence of dozens of people watching a moment they did not fully understand unfold in front of them. She could sense Corin's frustration radiating off him like heat from a fire, could hear Garrett's sharp intake of breath somewhere behind her, could feel the entire structure of Ashwood's carefully maintained hierarchy shifting beneath her feet like ice beginning to crack. For 6 years, she had been invisible in this pack. tolerated only because of a debt to her father's memory that nobody bothered to explain to her. Now, in the space of a single morning, an alpha king had marched across mountain ranges to find her specifically, had spoken her father's name with something like reverence, had placed an old, worn horn into her hands as though it were a piece of unfinished history finally coming full circle. "Walk with me," Draven said quietly, extending something toward her that she realized, after a beat, was his arm, offered the way one might guide someone unfamiliar with unfamiliar terrain. She hesitated only a moment before accepting it, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her fingers, an unfamiliar steadiness in a morning that had upended everything she thought she understood about her own life. Behind them, Ashwood watched in stunned silence as the blind Omega they had spent years dismissing walked away from the ridge beside the very king whose arrival had sent their entire pack into a panic only hours before. Ren did not look back. She did not need to see their faces to know exactly what expression they wore, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found she did not particularly care. Whatever waited for her beyond this conversation, whatever truth Draven still had not spoken aloud, she intended to hear all of it, on her own terms, standing exactly as tall as she deserved to stand. Draven led her away from the ridge, past the edge of the training yard, until the sounds of Ashwood's gathered pack faded into a low murmur behind them. Ren kept her hand resting lightly on his arm, letting him guide her steps over uneven ground she did not yet know well enough to navigate alone, though she made careful note of every turn, every change in the terrain, memorizing the path the way she memorized everything. "You do not need to guide me so carefully," she said, when he slowed for the third time to warn her of a raised route crossing their path. "I have walked stranger ground than this without help." "I do not doubt that," Draven said, and there was something in his tone that sounded almost amused. "But I would rather warn you of a route than watch you stumble because I assumed you needed nothing at all. There is a difference between respect and neglect, and I have learned that most people mistake one for the other far too often." Ren considered that for a moment, surprised by how much the observation settled something uneasy in her chest. Most people in Ashwood either fussed over her as though she were made of glass, or ignored her entirely, as though her blindness made her invisible rather than simply unable to see. Nobody had ever quite managed the balance Draven seemed to strike so effortlessly. They stopped eventually beneath a stand of pine trees far enough from the pack that their conversation would carry to no one else. Ren released his arm and turned to face him directly, tilting her head slightly the way she always did when trying to place a voice precisely. "You said you had questions of your own," Draven said. "I would rather you ask them plainly than dance around them out of politeness. I suspect you are not someone who enjoys dancing around anything." "You suspect correctly." Ren folded her arms, steadying herself before the question that had been building in her chest since the moment his voice first carried across the ridge. "Why did it take you this long? If my father's death broke the horn's rhythm, if you were listening every morning hoping to hear it, why did you never simply come to Ashwood and ask what had happened? Why wait years for a signal that might never have come?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Ren wondered if she had overstepped some boundary she did not yet understand. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier composure, replaced by something rawer, more honest. "Because the promise was never mine to force upon anyone," he said. "My father swore that Blackthorn would answer the horn when it was sounded with true purpose, not simply resurrected because a debt existed on paper. If I had marched into Ashwood the moment your father died, demanding acknowledgement of an old promise, I would have been imposing my father's oath onto a pack that never asked to inherit it. The horn needed to be sounded, because someone chose to sound it, not because I demanded it be revived. And you believed that if I stopped, if the ritual died along with my father's memory, the debt would simply go unpaid forever? I believed that the debt would remain, whether or not it was ever collected," Draven said. "Some promises exist regardless of whether they are ever called upon, but I confess, there were mornings I feared the silence meant something had happened to Elias's line entirely, that there was no one left in Ashwood who remembered or cared enough to continue what he started." Ren felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest at that, an old grief resurfacing, sharper than she expected. "I continued it because I did not know how to let it go," she admitted. "Everyone in Ashwood thought I was foolish for it. They thought I was clinging to a dead man's habit because I could not accept that he was gone. Maybe they were right. I never understood why the horn mattered so much to him, only that it did, and that felt like reason enough. It mattered because he understood something most people forget," Draven said. "A promise kept quietly, without recognition or reward, is worth more than one kept loudly, for the sake of being seen keeping it. Your father saved my father's life, and asked for nothing in return. Not gold, not status, Not even acknowledgement beyond a single oath exchanged between two men who understood exactly what they owed each other. He taught you to sound that horn every morning not because he expected payment for it, but because some debts deserve to be honored simply because they are real. The wind shifted through the pines above them, carrying the scent of distant snow not yet fallen. Wren found herself unexpectedly moved by the image Draven painted, a version of her father she had known only in fragments, glimpsed through childhood memory rather than full understanding. She had always known he was a good man. She had never fully understood the shape of the goodness he carried, nor the weight of what it had cost him to carry it quietly for so many years. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "You said you intend to honor the debt properly. What does that mean exactly?" Draven hesitated, and in that hesitation, Wren sensed something shift, some deeper truth still waiting beneath the surface of everything he had told her so far. "There is more to why I came than simply the debt," he admitted. "Though the debt is real, and I do intend to see it settled, but there is another matter, one I have not yet spoken of, one that concerns you far more directly than you may realize." Wren's pulse quickened. "Then speak of it." "Not yet," Draven said, and though his voice remained gentle, there was a firmness beneath it that told her pressing further would gain her nothing. "There are things I must confirm first, things I do not wish to speak of until I am certain, because I would rather stay silent than fill your head with possibilities that may prove false. I ask only for your patience a while longer." Frustration flickered through her, sharp and immediate, but beneath it, something else stirred too, a curiosity she could not quite suppress. Whatever Draven was withholding, it clearly weighed on him, carried a gravity that went beyond simple diplomacy or old family debts. She thought of the way he had asked for her by name before anyone else, the way his voice had shifted when he spoke of her father, the careful, deliberate manner in which he chose every word as though testing its weight before releasing it into the world. "Fine," she said eventually. "I will be patient, but not indefinitely." A faint sound escaped him that might have been a quiet laugh. "I would expect nothing less from Elias's daughter." They stood together beneath the pines a while longer, the silence between them comfortable in a way Wren had not expected from a stranger who had appeared so suddenly in her life, only hours before. She found herself listening to the small details of him the way she listened to everything, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint creak of leather as he shifted his weight, the low, careful cadence of a voice belonging to someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed, yet who had spoken to her, so far, without a trace of condescension. When they finally made their way back toward Ashwood, the pack had gathered in tense clusters throughout the yard, watching their approach with a mixture of suspicion and open curiosity. Corin stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, jaw tight, clearly having spent the last hour stewing over his own irrelevance in a matter he had assumed would be his to control. "Well," the Alpha demanded the moment they were within earshot, "what have you decided? What does Blackthorn intend to do with Ashwood?" "Nothing. For now," Draven said evenly. "I have no quarrel with your pack, Alpha Corin, provided you have no quarrel with me. My business here concerns an old debt, and a newer matter I am not yet prepared to discuss. I would ask that my people be permitted to camp near your borders for a few days while that matter is resolved." Corin's expression flickered with something between relief and renewed suspicion, clearly unable to decide which reaction served him better. "And the girl?" he asked, glancing toward Wren with an expression she could not see but could easily imagine, given the tone of his voice. "What role does she play in whatever business you have not yet disclosed?" "That," Draven said, "remains to be seen." Wren felt the weight of that answer settle over her like a held breath, unanswered and unresolved, but no longer entirely unwelcome. Whatever truth Draven was circling, whatever piece of her own life she did not yet understand, she found herself, for the first time in years, genuinely eager to discover it rather than afraid of what it might reveal. The horn her father once carried rested still in her hands, the twin gifted to her by Draven tucked carefully beneath her arm, and as the pack dispersed slowly around her, murmuring and speculating in tones they clearly believed were quieter than they actually were, Wren allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a future entirely different from the one she had resigned herself to only that morning. 3 days passed with the Blackthorn camp settled quietly at the edge of Ashwood's territory, close enough to remind everyone of their presence, far enough to avoid provoking open conflict. Wren found herself drawn back to that same stand of pine trees each morning after sounding the horn, and each morning, Draven was already waiting there, as though some invisible thread now connected the two of them, pulling them toward the same quiet meeting place without either needing to say a word about it. On the third morning she arrived to find him seated on a fallen log, turning something over in his hands. She could hear the faint scrape of metal against wood, a slow, deliberate sound, and she settled beside him without waiting for an invitation, something that would have felt impossible only days earlier. "You are troubled," she said, before he could speak first. "I can hear it in the way you're not saying anything." Draven let out a breath that carried the weight of several sleepless nights. "I have spent 3 days observing you," he admitted, "and I confess, what I have seen has only deepened the questions I already carried." "Observing me?" Ren arched an eyebrow, more curious than offended. "I hadn't noticed." "That is precisely what troubles me," he said. "You should have noticed. A blind Omega, alone, walking unfamiliar terrain surrounded by an entire camp of foreign wolves, and yet you have never once stumbled, never once hesitated, at a turn you had not memorized in advance. 3 mornings ago, you crossed the eastern field during a windstorm strong enough to knock over a supply tent, and you never broke stride." Ren considered his words carefully, unsure how to respond. She had never thought much about her own abilities beyond the practical necessity of survival. Blindness had forced her to develop instincts most people never needed, an awareness of sound and scent and the subtle shift of air currents that told her more about her surroundings than sight ever could. She had simply assumed, all these years, that this was the natural consequence of losing one sense and sharpening the others in response. "I've had years to adapt," she said. "That's all it is." "Perhaps," Draven said, though his tone made clear he did not fully believe it. "But adaptation explains competence. It does not explain what I witnessed yesterday evening, when one of my own scouts approached the camp from the northern trail, moving silently enough that even my most experienced trackers failed to notice him until he was nearly upon us. You turned toward that trail nearly a full minute before he appeared, Ren. You knew he was coming before any of us did." Ren's chest tightened at the memory. She had noticed it herself in the moment, a strange prickling awareness that had pulled her attention toward the trail before any sound or scent had reached her that she could consciously identify. She had dismissed it at the time as simple habit, the same instinct that had kept her safe through years of navigating a world built for people who could see. "I don't know what that was," she admitted quietly. "It happens sometimes. A feeling, before the sound or the smell arrives. I've always had it, at least since I lost my sight. I assumed everyone developed something similar, given enough time." "They do not," Draven said, and now his voice carried something closer to certainty, the tone of a man confirming a suspicion rather than merely voicing one. "I have known trackers with decades of experience who possess nothing close to what you carry instinctively. What you're describing, Ren, is not adaptation. It is something else entirely." "Then what is it?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, and Ren could hear him turning the object in his hands again, the same slow, deliberate scraping sound she had noticed when she first arrived. "There is an old bloodline," he said eventually. "Nearly forgotten now. Spoken of mostly in stories parents tell their children to explain why certain wolves seem to see more than their eyes could ever show them. They were called sentinels. Warriors and guides who traded their physical sight for something far rarer, an awareness that went beyond the 5 senses entirely, a perception tied to the world itself rather than merely their own bodies." Ren felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "You think I'm one of these sentinels?" "I think it is possible," Draven said carefully. "I do not say this lightly, nor do I say it to flatter you, or manipulate you into believing yourself something greater than you are. I say it because I have spent years searching for confirmation that the bloodline still exists, and everything I have witnessed these past 3 days aligns with stories I once believed were nothing more than legend." "Why would you spend years searching for something like that?" Ren asked, though even as she spoke the words, she suspected she already understood the shape of the answer waiting beneath his careful silence. Draven exhaled slowly, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. Heavier than duty, heavier than an old family debt. "Because my kingdom is dying, Ren, and I have been told that only a sentinel can save it." The words settled over her like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through every assumption she had made about why he had come to Ashwood in the first place. "Dying how?" "A curse," Draven said, "laid upon my bloodline 3 generations ago by an enemy my great-grandfather wronged beyond forgiveness. Each generation of Blackthorn rulers grows weaker than the last, our strength fading, our lands slowly losing the vitality that once made them thrive. My father spent his final years searching for any means to break it, and found none. Before he died, an old healer told him that only someone born of true sentinel blood could see through the curse's foundation and unmake it, but that such bloodlines had grown so rare, so scattered across forgotten packs, that finding one might prove impossible." Ren sat in stunned silence, processing the sudden shift in everything she thought she understood about why Draven had come. The debt to her father, the promise kept across decades, all of it real, all of it true, and yet beneath that truth lay something far larger, a purpose that had nothing to do with honor, and everything to do with desperate necessity. "You came here hoping I might be this sentinel," she said slowly, "not simply to honor a debt." "Both things are true," Draven said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice now, a vulnerability she had not expected from a king. "The debt to your father is real, and I would have come to settle it regardless of anything else, but I will not lie to you and pretend that hope did not also carry me here." When the horn finally answered after 6 years of silence, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps the timing was not coincidence at all. Ren turned the information over carefully, feeling the shape of her entire life shift beneath her once again, the way it had shifted 3 days ago when a second horn first answered hers across the mountains. "If I am this sentinel," she said slowly, "what would that mean for me? What would you ask of me?" "I would ask nothing you did not choose to give freely," Draven said immediately, firmly, as though the answer mattered enough to him that he needed her to hear the certainty in it. "I did not come here to claim you as a solution to my kingdom's troubles, Ren. I came here because a promise was owed, and because hope told me there might be more waiting to be discovered. Whatever you decide, whatever role you choose to play in what comes next, that decision belongs entirely to you." She sat with that for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the pines, feeling the weight of a choice she had not asked for settle over her shoulders like a mantle she was not certain she wanted to wear. 6 years of being told she was worthless, 6 years of climbing a tower every morning for a ritual everyone else dismissed as foolish, and now a king sat beside her insisting that ritual had been a thread connecting her to a power that might save an entire kingdom from a curse that had haunted it for generations. "I need time," she said finally. "This is too much to decide in a single morning." "Take whatever time you need," Draven said. "I am not going anywhere, Ren. Not until this is resolved, one way or another." She nodded slowly, rising from the log, feeling the weight of the twin horn resting against her side, the one her father had once carried, and the one Draven had gifted her, both of them now bound together in a story far larger than she had ever imagined her small, quiet life could hold. As she made her way back toward Ashwood, she found herself listening more carefully than ever to the world around her, straining to identify that strange, prickling awareness Draven had described, wondering, for the first time, if it truly was something more than simple habit born of necessity. Behind her, unseen, Draven watched her go, and in the quiet after her footsteps faded, he allowed himself, for the first time in years, to hope that the answer his kingdom desperately needed might finally, impossibly, be within reach. Word of the private conversations between Ren and Draven spread through Ashwood faster than Ren expected, twisted and reshaped by every mouth that carried it, until the story bore little resemblance to the truth. By the time she returned from the pine trees each morning, she could hear the whispers following her through the yard, sharp with speculation, some of it curious, most of it laced with the same resentment she had grown used to over the years, though now tinged with something new. Jealousy, perhaps, or fear of a shift in status they could not yet fully understand. Corin summoned her that evening, his voice carrying through the pack house with an authority that had grown noticeably more strained over the past several days. Ren made her way to his chambers slowly, in no hurry to endure whatever lecture awaited her, and found the alpha pacing when she arrived, his footsteps heavy and uneven against the wooden floor. "You've been meeting with him," Corin said, not bothering with any pretense of a greeting. "Every morning, alone. Do you have any idea how that looks to the rest of the pack?" "I imagine it looks like exactly what it is," Ren said evenly. "Two people talking." "Two people talking," Corin repeated, his voice climbing toward something sharper. "Ren, that man is the ruler of an entire kingdom, and you are an Omega with no standing in this pack whatsoever. Whatever he wants from you, whatever games he's playing, you need to understand that it is not your place to negotiate on Ashwood's behalf." "I haven't negotiated anything," Ren said, keeping her voice level despite the frustration building in her chest. "He hasn't asked me to speak for Ashwood. His business with me has nothing to do with pack politics." "Then what does it have to do with?" Corin demanded, stopping his pacing abruptly. "Because I find it very difficult to believe that a king travels across mountain ranges with an armed camp merely to reminisce about an old debt with the daughter of a dead hornkeeper. There is more happening here than you're telling me, and I want to know what it is." Ren hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. She had not yet decided what to do with Draven's revelation about the Sentinel bloodline, had not yet even fully processed it herself, and she certainly did not trust Corin to handle such information with anything resembling wisdom or restraint. The Alpha had spent 6 years treating her as an inconvenience to be tolerated, rather than a person worth understanding, and she saw no reason to believe a single dramatic morning had changed that fundamentally. "It's not your business," she said finally. "Draven's matter with me is personal. It doesn't concern Ashwood's territory or its politics." Corin's expression darkened, and for a moment, Ren thought he might actually raise his voice loud enough to be heard through the walls. Instead, he seemed to catch himself, visibly reining in his temper, though the effort cost him something she could hear in the tightness of his breathing. "You forget your place," he said quietly, which somehow felt more threatening than shouting would have. "Whatever standing you believe you've gained from this king's sudden interest, you are still Omega in this pack, Ren. That does not change because a stranger decided to speak your name." "No," Ren agreed. "It doesn't change because of anything he said. It changes because I've decided it should." She left his chambers before he could respond, her heart pounding with an adrenaline she rarely allowed herself to feel, a mixture of fear and defiance that left her hands trembling slightly as she made her way back through the pack house. She had never spoken to Corin that way before, had never dared challenge his authority so directly, and though a part of her worried about the consequences, a larger part of her felt something close to relief at finally saying aloud what she had wanted to say for years. The following morning, Corin appeared at the edge of the pine grove uninvited, arriving before Ren and Draven's usual meeting time, clearly intent on inserting himself into a conversation he had been excluded from for days. Ren heard him approaching long before he arrived, his footsteps heavy with barely contained irritation, and she felt her stomach tighten in anticipation of whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Alpha Corin," Draven said, his voice carrying the same even calm it always did, though Ren detected a faint edge beneath it now, something colder than she had heard from him before. "I was not expecting you." "I imagine not," Corin said, his tone sharp, "given that you've spent the past several mornings deliberately excluding me from conversations concerning my own pack's future. My business with Ren does not concern Ashwood's future," Draven said. "I have made that clear to you already." "Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe," Corin said, "given the sudden and rather dramatic interest you've taken in a girl your own father apparently promised to protect decades ago. I would like to understand exactly what you intend to gain from all of this, King Draven, before you continue involving yourself further in matters that affect my pack's stability." There was a pause, brief but heavy, before Draven responded, and when he did, his voice carried a firmness that Ren had not heard from him before, sharp enough to make Corin's next breath catch audibly. "Alpha Corin, I have been patient with you out of respect for the fact that this is your territory, and I have no wish to cause unnecessary conflict between our packs. But I will remind you, once, that my business with Ren is my own, and it does not require your permission, your approval, or your continued interference. If you wish to discuss matters of territory or alliance between Ashwood and Blackthorn, I am happy to speak with you directly and openly, but my conversations with Ren are not open for negotiation, and I would ask that you respect that boundary going forward." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Ren could hear Corin's breathing grow uneven, torn between the urge to push back further and the clear understanding that doing so would gain him nothing against a king who held far more power and far more patience than he had anticipated. Finally, without another word, she heard him turn and walk away, his footsteps heavy and quick, carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of humiliation. Once his footsteps had faded entirely, Ren let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "That was not necessary," she said, though she found she did not entirely mean it. "Perhaps not," Draven admitted, "but I have watched the way he speaks to you these past several days, Ren, and I find I have very little patience left for it. You deserve better than the treatment this pack has given you, and I will not pretend otherwise simply to preserve some fragile peace with a man who clearly has no intention of treating you with the respect you're owed." Ren felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, an unfamiliar feeling she was not entirely sure how to name. Nobody had ever defended her so directly before, certainly not to Corin's face, and the simple fact of it left her momentarily unable to find a response. "You barely know me," she said eventually, though the words came out softer than she intended. "I know enough," Draven said. "I know that you have spent 6 years honoring a promise nobody else understood, that you have endured mockery and dismissal without ever abandoning what you believed was right, and that despite everyone in this pack treating you as though you were less than nothing, you have never once behaved as though you believed them. That tells me a great deal about who you are, Ren, regardless of how little time we've spent together." She had no response for that, none that felt adequate to the moment, so instead she simply sat with the warmth of his words, letting them settle into the space where 6 years of doubt and dismissal had carved out a hollow ache she had learned to carry quietly. Whatever came next, whatever decision she eventually made about the Sentinel bloodline and the curse threatening Draven's kingdom, she found herself increasingly certain that whatever future awaited her, it would not be the small, diminished life Ashwood had always assumed was the only one available to her. Behind them, unseen, word of Draven's confrontation with Corrin was already spreading through the pack, carried by whoever had lingered close enough to overhear, and by midday, Ren could feel an unmistakable shift in the air around Ashwood, a nervous recalculation happening in real time, as the pack began to understand that the balance of power within their own territory had quietly, irrevocably changed. 2 more days passed, and with them came a shift in how Draven and Ren spent their mornings together. He no longer simply waited for her beneath the pines to talk. Instead, he began, carefully and without pressure, to test the strange awareness he suspected lived somewhere inside her, curious to understand its true shape and limits, before either of them assumed too much about what it meant. "Close your eyes," he told her one morning, though the instruction made her laugh softly, given that her eyes remained closed to the world regardless of her own effort. "They're always closed," she reminded him, in a manner of speaking. "Humor me," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, warmer now than it had been on their first meeting, familiar in a way that surprised her given how few days had actually passed. "I want you to simply stand still and tell me what you notice, without trying to reach for anything specific. Let it come to you rather than searching for it." Ren stood quietly among the pines, letting her senses settle the way they always did, the familiar catalog of sound and scent and air movement assembling itself automatically in her mind. The wind moving through the branches above, the distant murmur of the Blackthorn camp preparing breakfast, the particular, earthy scent of frost beginning to melt against the forest floor. And then, faint but unmistakable, something else. A presence, moving slowly through the trees perhaps 30 paces away, careful and quiet, clearly attempting not to be noticed. "There's someone approaching," she said quietly, "from the east, moving carefully, like they don't want to be heard." Draven made a soft sound of acknowledgement. "That would be Callum, one of my most skilled trackers. I asked him to approach as quietly as he could manage, using every technique at his disposal to avoid detection. Tell me, Ren, how did you know he was there? What told you, specifically?" Ren considered the question carefully, trying to isolate the exact sensation from the layered awareness that had alerted her. "It wasn't sound, not really," she said slowly. "Not scent either, not at that distance. It was more like a pressure. A weight in the air where he was standing, like the space around him had changed somehow, even though nothing had actually touched me yet." "That is precisely the description given in the old stories," Draven said, and she could hear something like quiet excitement building beneath his measured tone. Sentinels were said to perceive the presence of others not through the ordinary senses, but through an awareness of disruption in the world around them, a sensitivity to the simple fact of another living thing existing nearby, regardless of distance or concealment. "That sounds almost impossible," Ren said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew it was not impossible at all, because she had just experienced it herself, plainly and undeniably. "Most extraordinary things sound impossible," Draven said, "until someone proves otherwise." Over the following hours, he continued testing her carefully, never pushing beyond what felt comfortable, always pausing to ask how she felt before continuing further. She found herself identifying the presence of scouts moving through the forest from increasingly greater distances, distinguishing between the particular signatures of different individuals the way she might once have distinguished between voices, sensing the approach of a small herd of deer moving through a distant clearing long before any ordinary tracker could have detected them. By mid-afternoon, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. Ren stood near the edge of the pine grove, listening to Draven describe the layout of his kingdom's northern border, when a sudden, sharp pressure bloomed in her chest, entirely different from anything she had felt during their earlier tests. It was not the gentle, distant awareness of a presence approaching carefully. It was urgent, immediate, carrying with it an unmistakable sense of danger. "Someone's coming," she said abruptly, cutting Draven off mid-sentence. "Fast, not trying to hide at all." Draven fell instantly silent, his posture shifting beside her, and moments later, she heard it too, ordinary hearing catching up to whatever instinct had already warned her. Footsteps, running hard, breathing ragged with exertion, approaching from the direction of the Blackthorn camp. "My lord." The voice belonged to a young scout, breathless and clearly alarmed. Riders approaching from the western pass, moving fast, We count at least a dozen unfamiliar markings, closing quickly on the camp's flank. Draven's entire demeanor shifted in an instant, the warmth of moments earlier replaced by something sharper, more commanding. Numbers and formation. Loose formation, my lord, moving at speed rather than in disciplined ranks. Could be scouts themselves, testing our position, or could be the beginning of something larger. Sound the alert, Draven said. Quietly, no horns yet. I don't want to provoke a confrontation before we understand their intentions. He turned toward Ren, his voice dropping, urgent but controlled. Stay close to me. Whatever you sensed a moment ago, whatever warned you before the scout even arrived, I need you to trust it completely right now. Ren nodded, her heart pounding, the strange pressure in her chest still humming faintly, though it had shifted now, settling into something she could almost read like a map, an awareness of movement and distance that felt less like guessing and more like simply knowing. They're not heading for the main camp, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. They're circling toward the supply stores, the eastern side, where fewer of your people are stationed. Draven's head turned sharply toward her. How do you know that? I don't know how I know it, she admitted, but I'm certain of it. He hesitated only a moment before making his decision, and Ren felt a fierce, unexpected pride settle over her at the trust he extended without further question. Redirect our people eastward, he told the scout, quietly. If she's right, we intercept them before they reach the supplies. If she's wrong, we've simply repositioned defensively, and no harm is done. The scout hesitated, glancing uncertainly toward Ren, clearly unsettled by the idea of reorganizing an entire defensive position based on the instincts of a blind Omega from a neighboring pack. But Draven's expression must have carried enough authority to override any doubt, because the young man nodded quickly and sprinted back toward the camp to relay the order. They followed at a quicker pace, Ren's hand once again resting on Draven's arm, though this time there was nothing hesitant in the way she moved, her strange awareness guiding her steps with a confidence that startled even her. As they approached the eastern edge of the camp, the pressure in her chest sharpened further, resolving into something almost like a direction, pulling her attention toward a low ridge overlooking the supply stores. There, she said, pointing without needing to see, her certainty absolute. They're using the ridge for cover, planning to approach from higher ground. Draven relayed the information quickly to the small group of Blackthorn wolves who had gathered in response to the alert, and within minutes, they had repositioned to intercept the approaching riders exactly where Ren had indicated. When the unfamiliar group finally came into view, cresting the ridge with clear intent toward the supply stores below, they found themselves met not by an unprepared camp, but by a defensive position, already anticipating their exact approach. The confrontation ended quickly and without serious incident once the strangers realized they had lost the advantage of surprise entirely. They turned out to be a small band of opportunistic raiders, unaffiliated with any organized pack, hoping to exploit what they assumed would be a disorganized foreign camp unfamiliar with the local terrain. Faced with a defense that had somehow anticipated their exact strategy, they retreated quickly, choosing not to risk further confrontation against an enemy that seemed to know their intentions before they had even fully committed to them. Afterward, as the camp settled back into its normal rhythm, Draven found Ren standing quietly at the edge of the ridge, still processing the strange, humming awareness that had guided her so precisely through the entire encounter. You saved my people today, he said quietly, coming to stand beside her, without ever needing to see a single thing. I don't understand it, Ren admitted, her voice carrying equal parts wonder and unease. An hour ago, I could sense someone hiding 30 paces away. By the time those riders appeared, I could tell you exactly where they planned to strike before they had even committed to the attempt. It's growing, isn't it? Whatever this is. I believe it is, Draven said carefully. And I believe, more than ever, that what we witnessed today confirms exactly what the old stories described. You are not simply blind, Ren. You are becoming something the world has not seen in a very long time. Ren said nothing for a long moment, letting the weight of his words settle over her, feeling the shape of her own life shifting once again beneath her feet, faster now than she could have anticipated only a week earlier. Whatever she was becoming, whatever ancient bloodline had chosen, for reasons she still did not fully understand, to awaken inside her after so many years of dormancy, she found herself no longer afraid of the answer. If anything, she found herself eager to discover exactly how far this awakening might carry her. Night fell over Ashwood differently than it usually did, thick with an unease Ren could not quite name, though the strange pressure in her chest had been building steadily since sundown, low and persistent, refusing to fade no matter how many times she tried to dismiss it as simple nerves. She sat near the edge of the training yard, listening to the pack settle into its evening routines, and found herself unable to shake the growing certainty that something was wrong. She found Draven near the Blackthorn camp's perimeter, speaking quietly with two of his advisors, and the moment she approached, he turned toward her immediately, sensing without needing to be told that something had prompted her visit. "You feel it too," he said, not a question. "Something's coming," Ren said. "Not like the raiders from before. This feels different. Heavier. Closer." Draven's expression sharpened, and he exchanged a quick glance with his advisors before turning his full attention back to her. "Can you tell direction? Distance?" Ren closed her eyes, though the gesture was more habit than necessity, letting the strange awareness settle over her the way it had during their earlier tests. The pressure was diffuse, harder to pin down than before, as though whatever approached was spread across a wider area rather than concentrated in a single group. "North and west both," she said slowly. "More than one group. Moving carefully, but not carefully enough to hide entirely. I think they mean to come from two directions at once." "That is not the strategy of opportunistic raiders," one of Draven's advisors said grimly. "That is a coordinated assault." Draven's jaw tightened, and Ren heard him draw a slow breath before responding, the calm, measured tone of a leader forcing himself to think clearly despite the urgency building around him. "Alert Ashwood immediately. Whatever is coming, it threatens both our camps equally, and there is no time to argue about jurisdiction or territory." The next several minutes passed in a blur of urgent activity, messengers dispatched, defensive positions organized, the previously separate camps of Ashwood and Blackthorn suddenly forced into uneasy cooperation by a threat neither could afford to face alone. Ren found herself standing at the center of it all, her strange, growing awareness serving as the clearest warning system either pack possessed, more reliable than any scout stationed along the perimeter. Corin arrived at the makeshift command point, breathless and visibly shaken, his earlier resentment toward Draven apparently forgotten entirely in the face of a threat that made old grievances irrelevant. "What do we know?" he demanded. "Two groups, approaching from the north and west," Draven said. "Likely intending to catch us in a pincer, striking both flanks simultaneously before we can properly organize a unified defense." "Who would coordinate something like this?" Corin asked, though the question seemed to carry an edge of dread rather than genuine confusion, as though some part of him already suspected the answer. Draven's expression darkened. "I believe I know," he said quietly. "There is a faction, remnants of the pack responsible for the border conflict decades ago, the same conflict that first bound our families through the debt now being repaid. They never fully disbanded after their defeat. They scattered, hid, waited. I had hoped they had faded into irrelevance over the years. It appears I was wrong." Ren felt the pressure in her chest sharpen suddenly, resolving with startling clarity into something almost like a countdown. "They're closer than we think," she said urgently. "Minutes, not hours. We need to move now." Nobody questioned her this time. Whatever doubt had lingered about her strange abilities had evaporated entirely in the wake of the earlier encounter with the raiders, and the combined forces of Ashwood and Blackthorn scrambled into position with an urgency that left little room for hesitation. The attack came exactly as Ren predicted, two coordinated groups descending from the north and west simultaneously, moving with a discipline that confirmed Draven's fears about their true nature. But Ashwood and Blackthorn, forewarned and prepared, met the assault with a defense far more organized than their attackers had anticipated. Ren remained near the command point throughout the encounter, her awareness stretched thin across the entire battlefield, calling out warnings and shifts in the enemy's positioning, with an accuracy that left even Draven's most experienced advisors stunned into silence. She sensed a flanking maneuver forming along the eastern tree line before it fully materialized, allowing Draven to redirect a small contingent just in time to intercept it. She felt the hesitation building in the attacking force's second wave, sensing their resolve wavering moments before they actually began to retreat, information that allowed the defenders to press their advantage at exactly the right moment. The confrontation ended faster than anyone had dared hope, the attacking force retreating in disarray once it became clear that whatever advantage they had counted on, the element of surprise chief among it, had been stripped away entirely before the assault even began. As the chaos settled and the defenders regrouped, checking for injuries and accounting for everyone present, Ren found herself trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the awareness she had maintained throughout the entire encounter, a mental effort unlike anything she had ever experienced before. Draven found her sitting near the edge of the yard afterward, her hands still shaking slightly as the adrenaline of the encounter slowly drained from her system. He knelt beside her without a word, simply present, allowing her the space to steady herself before speaking. You held that awareness across the entire field, he said eventually, quiet wonder threading through his voice. For nearly 20 minutes, tracking multiple threats simultaneously, without ever losing focus. Ren, I've never heard of anyone maintaining that level of perception for so long, let alone someone who has only recently discovered they possess the ability at all. It felt like holding my breath the entire time, Ren admitted, her voice unsteady. Like the moment I stopped concentrating, everything would collapse. You didn't stop, Draven said. Not once. Whatever price this ability demands, you paid it willingly tonight, and because of it, both our packs stand largely unharmed against an enemy that clearly intended far worse. Around them, the aftermath of the encounter continued to settle, pack members from both Ashwood and Blackthorn moving between each other with a cautious but unmistakable new respect. The earlier tension between the two camps dissolved almost entirely in the face of a shared threat successfully repelled. Corin approached slowly, his earlier hostility toward Ren replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine gratitude, though he seemed uncertain how to voice it after years of treating her with open disdain. Whatever you did tonight, he said finally, standing awkwardly before her. Ashwood owes you a debt I don't fully understand, but one I recognize nonetheless. Ren considered his words carefully, weighing 6 years of dismissal against this single moment of grudging acknowledgement, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not particularly need his validation anymore. I did what needed to be done, she said simply, nothing more. Corin nodded slowly, clearly recognizing that whatever standing he had once held over her had shifted permanently, and retreated without further comment, leaving Ren alone once again with Draven beneath the settling quiet of a night that had nearly turned catastrophic. Rest now, Draven said gently. Whatever comes next, it can wait until morning. Tonight, you have more than earned the right to simply breathe. Ren allowed herself, finally, to lean back against the cool stone beside her, letting the exhaustion of the encounter wash over her fully, now that the danger had passed. Whatever she was becoming, whatever ancient power had chosen this moment in her life to awaken fully, she understood now, with a clarity she had not possessed even hours earlier, that there would be no returning to the small, diminished life she had once resigned herself to living. Morning brought with it a strange clarity Ren had not expected after the exhaustion of the previous night. She woke early, before the horn's usual hour, and found herself climbing the 51 steps to the tower with a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the strange awareness she had carried since Draven's arrival. For the first time in years, sounding the horn felt less like clinging to her father's memory and more like announcing something new entirely, a chapter of her life beginning rather than an old one refusing to end. When she descended, Draven was waiting at the base of the tower, an old healer standing beside him that Ren did not recognize by voice or scent. The stranger's presence carried an unusual quality, something dry and herbal, layered with the faint metallic tang Ren had come to associate with age and long study. This is Ines, Draven said. She has traveled a great distance to reach us, at my request. She is one of the few remaining scholars who still studies the old bloodlines, including the Sentinels. After last night, I felt it was time to seek confirmation beyond simple observation. The old woman stepped closer, and Ren felt her presence shift into something more focused, studying rather than simply standing nearby. May I take your hand, child? Ines asked, her voice gentle but carrying an unmistakable authority earned through decades of practice. Ren extended her hand without hesitation, and the moment Ines's fingers closed around hers, a strange warmth spread up through her arm, subtle but undeniable, like sunlight breaking briefly through cloud cover. Ines held her hand in silence for a long moment, her breathing slow and measured, before finally releasing it with a soft exhale. There is no doubt, the healer said quietly. The signature is unmistakable, faint traces of an old awakening resonance woven through her entire being. This girl carries true Sentinel blood, and if what King Draven has described of the past several days holds true, that blood has already begun to fully awaken within her. Ren felt her pulse quicken, the confirmation landing with a weight she had not fully anticipated, despite everything she had already witnessed in herself over the past week. What does that mean exactly? She asked, beyond what I've already experienced. Sentinels were rare even in the ages when their bloodline thrived openly, Ines explained. Their gift came at a cost. Their physical sight traded for a perception that extended far beyond the ordinary senses, an awareness capable of perceiving threats, intentions, and even certain forms of ancient magic invisible to everyone else. As their awareness deepened, so too did their capacity to interact with forces that ordinary wolves could never touch. Curses, blessings, bindings woven into bloodlines or territories, All of these become perceivable, and eventually, manipulable, to a fully awakened sentinel. You believe I could break the curse on Draven's kingdom? Ren said slowly, the pieces settling together with a clarity that left her breathless. I believe it is possible, Ines said carefully, though I will not pretend the process would be simple, or without risk. A curse layered across 3 generations carries deep roots, and unmaking it would require your awareness to reach further than anything you have yet attempted, deep into the foundation of the binding itself. It is not without danger, child. Sentinels who reach too far, too quickly, before their gift has fully matured, have been known to lose themselves entirely in the attempt. Ren absorbed the warning carefully, weighing it against everything she had already risked and gained over the past week. What would happen if I lost myself, as you put it? The mind can fracture under the weight of perceiving too much, too directly, Ines said. Some sentinels who attempted premature bindings were left permanently altered, trapped in a state of overwhelming awareness they could no longer control or shut out. It is why the old texts insist that a sentinel's gift must be allowed to mature naturally before it is tested against something as significant as an ancestral curse. Draven's expression, which Ren could hear shift through the tension in his breathing, carried clear reluctance now, a visible internal struggle between his kingdom's desperate need and his unwillingness to risk Ren's well-being for it. Then we wait, he said firmly. Whatever timeline her gift requires to mature safely, we will wait for it. I will not ask her to risk herself before she is ready, regardless of what my kingdom currently faces. You may not have that luxury, Ines said gently, though not unkindly. I sense urgency in your bloodline's condition, King Draven. Curses like this rarely remain static. They deepen over time, and if left unaddressed for too much longer, the damage may eventually become permanent, beyond even a fully matured sentinel's ability to reverse. The weight of that warning settled heavily over all 3 of them, and Ren found herself caught between 2 truths she had not expected to face so directly, so soon. Her own safety, weighed against the survival of an entire kingdom she had known nothing about only a week earlier. A kingdom whose fate now rested, however impossibly, on the strength of a gift she barely understood herself. How long, Ren asked finally, before my gift matures enough to attempt this safely? Ines considered the question carefully. Based on what I have witnessed in your growth already, faster than most, given the speed at which your awareness expanded over these past days, perhaps a matter of weeks, rather than months or years, though I cannot promise precision in such an estimate. Sentinel awakenings are rarely uniform. Weeks, Draven repeated quietly, clearly turning the timeline over against whatever urgency pressed upon his kingdom's condition. That may be manageable. It will require careful guidance, Ines said. I would need to remain nearby, teaching Ren how to deepen her awareness deliberately, rather than allowing it to simply unfold as circumstance demands, as it has thus far. There is a difference between reacting instinctively to danger, as she did last night, and consciously directing her perception toward something as deliberate and complex as unmaking an ancestral binding. Ren felt the shape of her immediate future settling into focus, weeks of training ahead of her, guided by a stranger's careful instruction, working toward a moment that would test not only her growing gift but her own resilience against whatever risk that gift carried. It was a daunting prospect, and yet, standing there in the cool morning air, flanked by a king who had traveled across mountains to find her, and a scholar who had traveled even further to confirm what she truly was, Ren felt something she had not expected to feel given the gravity of the conversation. She felt ready. Then let's begin, she said, her voice steady despite everything Ines had just described. Whatever this requires, I would rather face it directly than wait for the curse to worsen while I hesitate out of fear of what might happen to me. Draven turned toward her sharply, something in his posture suggesting he wanted to argue, to insist she reconsider given the risks Ines had just outlined so plainly. But whatever protest had been forming in his chest seemed to die the moment he took in her expression, the quiet, unshakable resolve she knew must be written plainly across her face. Very well, he said finally, and though his voice carried lingering concern, it carried something else too, a respect that had been building steadily since the moment they first met, now settling into something closer to genuine admiration. We begin today. But I will not allow you to push yourself beyond what Ines advises is safe, Ren. Your well-being matters to me as much as any outcome we might achieve for Blackthorn. Ren felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, a feeling she had begun to recognize over the past week but had not yet allowed herself to name fully. Whatever this journey required of her, whatever risks and challenges still waited ahead, she found herself grateful, unexpectedly and completely, that she would not be facing them alone. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of careful, exhausting practice, each morning beginning with the familiar climb up the tower to sound the horn, followed by long hours spent under Inés's patient but demanding guidance. Ren learned to draw her awareness inward deliberately, shaping it like clay rather than simply reacting to whatever crossed her path unbidden. She learned to hold multiple threads of perception at once, without losing herself in the overwhelming rush of sensation. Learned to recognize the subtle signatures that distinguished ordinary danger from something older, stranger, woven from magic rather than mere intention. Draven remained close throughout the entire process, present at nearly every session despite the demands of managing a kingdom from a distance, and Ren found herself growing accustomed to his presence in a way that unsettled her more than the training itself. She had spent 6 years learning to need no one, to navigate a world that offered her little kindness without depending on anyone else's mercy to survive it. Yet somehow, in the space of only a few weeks, she had come to look forward to his company, with an eagerness she did not entirely know how to name. "You're distracted today," Inés observed one afternoon, midway through an exercise meant to help Ren distinguish the subtle resonance of old magic from ordinary background noise. "Your focus keeps slipping toward something else entirely." Ren flushed, grateful the old healer could not see the color rising in her cheeks, though she suspected Inés's own perceptiveness made the effort somewhat pointless regardless. "I'm trying," she said, which was not entirely a lie, though it was not entirely the truth either. Later that evening, after Inés had retired for the night, Ren found herself once again beneath the familiar stand of pine trees, Draven's presence settling beside her with the ease of routine now firmly established between them. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the branches above, before Draven finally spoke, his voice carrying an unusual hesitance she had not heard from him in some time. "I owe you an honesty I have not yet fully given," he said quietly. "When I first arrived in Ashwood, I told myself my primary purpose was honoring my father's debt, and that the possibility of finding a sentinel was simply a hope I carried alongside it. That was true, once. It is no longer the whole truth." Ren turned toward him, curiosity and something warmer stirring in her chest. "Then tell me the rest." "These past weeks," Draven continued, "watching you grow into this gift, watching the courage with which you faced something that could easily have overwhelmed someone less resilient, I find that my reasons for wanting to remain near you have shifted considerably from where they began. I no longer think of you primarily as the answer to my kingdom's curse, Ren. I think of you as someone I have come to care for deeply, regardless of what your gift may or may not accomplish." The words settled over her slowly, warm and unexpected, and Ren found herself momentarily unable to summon a response adequate to the moment. "I feel something similar," she admitted finally, her voice softer than she intended. "I didn't expect to. I came into this expecting a stranger who wanted something from me, and instead I found someone who has treated me with more respect in a few weeks than Ashwood managed in 6 years. You deserved that respect long before I arrived," Draven said. "I only regret that it took a stranger from beyond the mountains to offer it to you properly." They sat together a while longer, the conversation drifting into quieter, gentler territory, and Ren allowed herself, for the first time since her gift had begun to awaken, to simply exist in the moment without the weight of prophecy or duty pressing down upon her. Whatever came next, whatever the curse-breaking attempt eventually demanded of her, she found herself grateful for these quiet weeks, grateful for the unexpected warmth that had grown between them despite everything else competing for her attention. The day Inés finally declared her ready arrived sooner than Ren expected, nearly a month after the old healer's initial assessment. They gathered near the edge of Blackthorn's territory, close enough to the source of the curse that Ren's awareness could reach it properly, though Draven had insisted the actual attempt take place on neutral ground between the two kingdoms, unwilling to risk anything happening to her deep within Blackthorn's borders where fewer people could offer aid if something went wrong. "Remember everything we've practiced," Inés instructed, her voice steady despite the visible tension in her posture. "Reach carefully, layer by layer, and if the sensation becomes overwhelming at any point, withdraw immediately rather than pushing further. The curse's foundation will resist you. That resistance is expected, and it is not a sign that you should abandon the attempt, but neither is it something to fight against carelessly." Ren nodded, settling herself carefully, feeling the familiar hum of awareness building in her chest as she prepared to reach further than she ever had before. Draven knelt beside her, his hand resting gently against her shoulder, a silent reassurance rather than an interruption. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "know that I am here." She drew a slow breath and reached outward, letting her awareness expand beyond anything she had attempted in her previous weeks of training, searching for the particular signature Ines had described, the deep, ancient resonance of a binding woven across 3 generations of Blackthorn's bloodline. It took long moments to find it, buried beneath layers of ordinary sensation, but eventually, she felt it. A knot of old, tangled magic sitting heavy and cold at the very foundation of everything connected to Draven's family line. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced before, vast and resistant, radiating something that felt almost like malice, deliberate and old, laid there with clear intention to cause lasting harm. Ren pressed carefully against its edges, feeling the resistance Ines had warned her about. A pressure that pushed back against her awareness like a physical force determined to keep her out. She held steady, refusing to withdraw despite the growing strain, letting her perception trace the shape of the binding more fully, searching for whatever weakness might allow her to begin unraveling it. The effort demanded more of her than anything she had faced thus far, and she felt herself beginning to tremble under the weight of it, sweat gathering at her temples despite the cool evening air. "Ren?" Draven's voice reached her distantly, laced with concern. "You're shaking." "I'm close," she managed, her voice strained. "I can feel where it's woven thinnest. Just a moment longer." She pressed forward one final time, gathering everything she had learned over the past weeks, every ounce of careful control Ines had taught her, and focused it entirely on the single thinnest point in the ancient binding structure. The resistance fought back harder than ever, and for one terrifying moment, she felt herself teetering on the edge of exactly the danger Ines had warned her about, her awareness threatening to spiral beyond her control entirely. And then, with a final, deliberate push, something gave way. The sensation that followed was unlike anything Ren had ever experienced, a vast, unraveling release, as though a knot pulled tight for decades had finally, suddenly, come loose all at once. She gasped audibly, her body swaying, and felt Draven's arms catch her before she could fall, steadying her against a wave of dizziness that swept through her entire being. "Ren." His voice carried sharp alarm now, all composure momentarily forgotten. "Ren, can you hear me?" "I'm here," she managed, her voice weak but steady enough to reassure him. "It's done. I felt it break." Ines moved quickly to her side, taking her hand and pressing careful fingers against her wrist, checking for something Ren could not see but trusted the healer understood better than she did herself. After a long moment, Ines let out a slow breath, tension visibly draining from her posture. "Her pulse is steady," Ines said, relief evident in her voice. "Strained, but steady. I believe she has succeeded, and more importantly, I believe she has succeeded without losing herself in the process, which is more than I dared hope for on a first genuine attempt." Draven held Ren carefully, his hand smoothing gently over her hair, and Ren allowed herself, finally, to lean fully into his support, exhaustion settling over her now that the immense effort of the past several minutes had passed. "Did it work?" she asked quietly. "The curse, is it truly broken?" "We will need time to be certain," Ines said carefully. "Bindings this old do not always release cleanly, and it may take days for the full effects to become apparent throughout Blackthorn's lands. But what you did tonight, the way that resistance gave way beneath your effort, that is not something I have witnessed fail to produce results in the past. I believe, cautiously, that you have succeeded." Over the following days, word began to reach them from Blackthorn's territory, carried by messengers whose voices trembled with an excitement that needed no further confirmation. Fields that had grown increasingly barren over recent years showed signs of unexpected vitality returning. Livestock long plagued by unexplained illness began recovering rapidly. Elderly wolves who had struggled with fading strength reported feeling more vigorous than they had in years. Whatever ancient malice had been woven into Blackthorn's bloodline 3 generations earlier, it was unmistakably, undeniably unraveling, exactly as Ren had felt it release beneath her effort that evening. Draven received the reports with an expression Ren could hear clearly in the unsteady catch of his breath each time new news arrived, disbelief slowly giving way to overwhelming relief, and beneath both of those, something that sounded remarkably like gratitude too large to fully express in words. On the 5th day after the attempt, he found Ren once again beneath their familiar stand of pine trees, and this time, when he sat beside her, she could hear something different in the way he settled himself, a lightness that had not been present in any of their previous conversations. "The reports continue to improve," he said. "My advisors tell me Blackthorn has not seen conditions this favorable in decades. Whatever doubts remained about whether the curse had truly broken, they are gone now." "I'm glad," Ren said, and she meant it completely. feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over her that had nothing to do with recognition or reward, and everything to do with simply having helped, in whatever small way her gift allowed. An entire kingdom she had come to care about far more than she expected to when this journey first began. "Your father would be proud of you," Draven said quietly, "not simply for honoring his promise, though you have done that many times over now, but for the person you have become in the process of doing it." Ren felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, and she did not bother hiding them, no longer feeling the need to guard herself so carefully against vulnerability the way she once had. "I wish he could have seen this," she admitted. "All of it. The Horn answering, the debt he never spoke of properly, everything that's happened since." "Perhaps in some way he has," Draven said gently. "Some promises outlive the people who make them, carried forward by those who choose to honor them regardless of whether anyone is watching. I believe your father understood that better than most, and I believe he would recognize that same understanding in you now." They sat together quietly for a while longer, and eventually, the conversation drifted toward matters neither of them had directly addressed until now, the question of what came next, now that the immediate crisis had passed and Ren's role in breaking Blackthorn's curse had been fulfilled. "I have been thinking," Draven said carefully, "about what happens now, for you specifically. Ashwood has never truly valued what you offer, Ren, not the way you deserve. I do not say this to diminish your home, but I would be lying if I claimed otherwise, given everything I have witnessed during my time here." "I know," Ren said quietly. "I've known it for years, if I'm honest with myself." "Blackthorn would welcome you," Draven continued, his voice carrying a careful hesitance that suggested he was choosing his next words with particular deliberation. "Not merely as the sentinel who broke our ancestral curse, though you would certainly be honored for that. I would welcome you as someone I have come to care for deeply over these past weeks, someone whose company I find myself unwilling to imagine losing now that I have grown so thoroughly accustomed to it." Ren's breath caught, understanding the full weight of what he was offering, an invitation that extended far beyond simple gratitude or diplomatic courtesy. "You're asking me to leave Ashwood. I am asking you to consider a life beyond it," Draven corrected gently. "Whatever you decide, wherever you choose to build your future, I want you to know that the choice belongs entirely to you. But I would be lying if I did not tell you that I hope, more than I have hoped for almost anything else, that you might choose to build it alongside me." Ren sat with his words for a long moment, feeling the shape of her entire life stretching out before her in directions she could not have imagined only a month earlier. 6 years of climbing 51 steps every morning, mocked and dismissed by a pack that never understood what her devotion truly meant, and now, standing at the threshold of a future that offered her not only purpose but genuine belonging, genuine partnership with someone who had never once treated her as less than exactly what she was. "I choose it," she said finally, her voice steady despite the enormity of the decision. "I choose you, and whatever future waits for us in Blackthorn." The relief and joy in Draven's response was audible even before he spoke, a soft, unsteady exhale, followed by words that carried more warmth than she had ever heard from him before. "Then let us build it together, starting today." News of Ren's decision spread through Ashwood quickly, met with a complicated mixture of reactions, some genuinely happy for her, others clearly regretful of how they had treated her over the years, now that her true worth had become impossible to ignore. Corin, to his credit, offered a formal apology before her departure, awkward and incomplete but sincere enough that Ren found herself able to accept it without lingering resentment. On the morning of her departure, Ren climbed the 51 steps to Ashwood's tower one final time, the familiar horn resting in her hands exactly as it had every morning for 6 years. She raised it to her lips and blew, the sound rolling out across the mountains just as it always had, though this time, it carried a different weight entirely, not a debt awaiting payment, but a farewell offered with gratitude rather than obligation. Moments later, Draven's answering horn rose from where he waited at the base of the tower, deep and resonant, no longer a signal confirming an old promise, but the beginning of an entirely new one. Ren descended the tower steps slowly, savoring the familiar path one last time, and found him waiting exactly where she expected, his arm extended in the gesture that had become so familiar over the past weeks. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she confirmed, accepting his arm, and turning her face toward whatever future awaited her beyond the mountains. A future she would meet not as an overlooked Omega, dismissed by everyone around her, but as an honored sentinel, a partner, and a woman who had finally, fully claimed the worth she had always deserved. As they walked away from Ashwood together, the horn's sound still echoing faintly across the ridge behind them, Ren felt the weight of 6 years of quiet devotion finally settle into its true purpose. No longer a lonely ritual clung to out of grief, but the beginning thread of an entire new life, woven carefully, deliberately, into something far larger and far brighter than she had ever dared imagine for herself.